everyone. I hope you're doing well. Happy Sunday. Welcome back to our class. We are still in the book of Genesis, but today is our last week studying Genesis. So we're going to finish up Genesis. We're in Genesis 41 through 50 this week. So chapter 50 is the last chapter of the book of Genesis. So I'm very excited to finally finish a very large book. But I hope that it has been educational. I hope that you've learned something about God and about the Bible. We're in chapter 10 this week. Like I said, if you were to open your Bible, today we'd be talking about chapters 41 through chapter 50. You are free to read it on your own if you would like. We are going to go through our story time today and kind of cover some of the things that happen in these chapters that are really important, but I wanted to take a second and review last week's lesson. It's going to be very important in our story today. If you remember, we learned about Joseph last week. We learned about how he was the favorite of his father because his mother Rachel only had 2 children and Joseph was one of them. So Joseph was a favorite of his father and all of his other brothers got very jealous. So they ended up selling him into slavery, which is a stroke of bad luck for our buddy Joseph. But while in Egypt, he ends up being raised to the head of the house in Potiphar's household, a rich man. But then he was falsely accused and thrown in jail, and 2 servants had him interpret their dreams because no one else could do it. And he was like, just remember me when you go to Pharaoh again, remember me so I don't have to sit in this jail cell forever. And alas, the baker who went up and was saved out of jail forgot about Joseph. So last week we see Joseph sitting in a jail cell and we kind of left him there. We don't know what happens, but we were learning last week that God always works for the good, even in bad situations. And we're going to be learning a little bit more about that today. So I wanted to frame that because we are continuing the story today. We're going to learn about what happens to Joseph after. Does he get out of jail? A lot of you probably know the answer to that, but we're going to talk about it anyway. What happened to the brothers, you may wonder? We're also going to talk about that. What about the baker who forgot about him? We're going to talk about that too. So there are some loose strings that we're going to tie up today, and then we are taking a break until September 12th. So through August, we're going to have a little bit of a break, but then we're going to jump into Unit 3. So that was a whole lot, but I'm going to dig into Chapter 10. We are on page 67. And the theme of today's lesson is that God humbles his people so that he can exalt them. And our story title today is Joseph the Ruler. So yesterday we learned about Joseph in some really kind of bad situations. But today we're going to learn how they end up. Each week we learn something about who is God. And today we're learning that God has a divine plan for God's glory and our good. And what God plans always happens just as God plans it to. So we're going to learn a little bit more about how God is always working toward the good, even in some really hard situations. And sometimes we may not see why. And sometimes we may never know. But we're gonna learn a little bit about how this works out in Joseph's life. How we can see in our story today how God put Joseph in some really bad situations. But God was always working for the good of Joseph and God's people. So, with that, I'm going to have you turn to page 68 if you have your books. If you don't, that's fine. There will be a few times I may stop and point out something that's helpful for understanding our story a little bit better. But I would invite you to read along with me. Joseph the Ruler. "Tell me what my dreams mean," shouted Pharaoh. All the wise men in Egypt had no answer. Then the chief butler spoke. Great Pharaoh, today I remember my faults. I know who can tell you what the dreams mean. He told Pharaoh about Joseph. Bring this man to me, demanded Pharaoh. So if you remember last week, the butler, the chief butler, is one of the people who got thrown into prison for not satisfying Pharaoh. And he had a dream, and Joseph was able to interpret this dream and knew that the butler would be reinstated to his position in Pharaoh's house. And so all that Joseph asked was, I will interpret this dream for you with God's help, but I ask that you would remember me so that I can get out of jail. But the butler forgot. So this is a moment in our story where the butler sees that Pharaoh has a need for someone to interpret Pharaoh's dream, except none of his advisors have any idea what these dreams mean. So the butler remembers in this moment, oh no, I forgot about Joseph and what I promised him. So this is kind of the chief butler trying to make good or make good on his promise, even if he forgot for a while. I'm digging into our second paragraph now. Joseph stood before Pharaoh and listened to his dreams. There were 7 healthy, fat cows by the river. 7 ugly, skinny cows came along and ate up the fat cows, explained Pharaoh. Then I had a second dream. 7 plump heads of grain grew on one stalk. 7 thin heads sprung up and gobbled up the plump heads of grain. What do these dreams mean? Joseph said, God will give the meaning to these dreams. The 2 dreams are really one dream. The fat cows and plump heads of grain are 7 years of good harvest throughout Egypt. The skinny cows and thin heads of grain are 7 years of famine. Pharaoh should appoint men to harvest the grain during the 7 good years and store it. Then there will be enough food during the years of famine so that the people in Egypt will not die. Pharaoh believed Joseph's interpretation of the dreams because he saw the Spirit of God in Joseph. Pharaoh made Joseph a ruler in Egypt. Only Pharaoh had more power than Joseph. Does this mean that Joseph's childhood dreams of ruling over his brothers were coming true? For 7 years, Joseph oversaw the effort to store the extra grain. During that time, Pharaoh gave Asenath to Joseph as a wife, and Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. After 7 years, the famine came. Back in Canaan, Jacob and his family had no food. Jacob sent all of the brothers except Benjamin to Egypt to get food. Joseph immediately knew they were his brothers and decided to test them to see if they had changed. He called them spies and put them in prison for 3 days. Then he said that they must bring Benjamin with them on their next visit and let them go. He secretly put the money they had paid for the grain back in their sacks. So, first of all, you may be wondering, why was Joseph so mean to his brothers? Was it just because he was mad that they threw him into slavery? And I don't think that's what's happening here. I think Joseph was trying to figure out if his brothers had changed at all. Joseph was trying to figure out if they were still mean-spirited and revengeful, or if they had changed a little bit to reflect God's heart. And this was kind of Joseph's way of trying to figure out if his brothers had actually changed. Because at this point, they don't know that Joseph is who he is. The other thing is that you'll notice it says that Jacob kept Benjamin with him. Jacob, as the father, was really attached to Benjamin at this point, because if you remember a couple of weeks ago, you'll remember that Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, but Rachel was the wife he loved dearly. And Rachel only had 2 sons. One of them was Joseph, and the other is Benjamin. So at this point in the story, Jacob has no idea that his son Joseph is still alive. He thinks he's dead. So he hangs on to Benjamin because he can't bear the thought of losing him. So there's a lot going on in this story. I'm going to keep on continuing. I'm in the second paragraph on page 69. The grain ran out and the family needed more food. The brothers were afraid to go back to Egypt because of the money in their sacks. Jacob insisted, "We have no food." Reluctantly, Jacob let Benjamin go with them. The brothers returned to Egypt. Again, Joseph tested them. He put his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. On the way home, Joseph's men chased after them. When they found the cup in Benjamin's sack, the men arrested them. The brothers were frightened and pled for mercy. They did not know that this Egyptian ruler talking to them was their brother Joseph. Joseph couldn't keep the secret any longer. He wept out loud and said, "I am Joseph, your brother. Does my father still live?" Now the brothers were very afraid. What would this powerful ruler, whom they had sold into slavery as a boy, do to them? "Don't be afraid," said Joseph. "God had a plan. He sent me to Egypt to save your lives during this terrible famine. Now go back to Canaan and tell my father I am alive. Then come back to live in Egypt with me." At first, Jacob couldn't believe that Joseph was still alive. Then he said, "I will go and see Joseph before I die." So the family moved to Egypt. Years passed. Jacob died and was buried back in Canaan. Once again, the brothers were afraid. What would Joseph do to them now that Jacob had died? Joseph said to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph's dreams had come true. God had blessed Joseph and made him a mighty ruler. God had kept his promise to keep his people safe. They would live in Egypt for 400 years, and at the right time, return to claim Canaan as their own. God was keeping his promises. If you remember the promises that were made to Abraham way back in the beginning of the book of Genesis, you'll see that throughout the book of Genesis, and you will see throughout the rest of Exodus, that God is constantly keeping God's promises to God's people. And as we are digging into this story today, one of the huge themes of our story about Joseph and all the trials that Joseph went through is the idea of how we don't always see how God uses bad circumstances in our lives for good. Sometimes God doesn't cause the bad circumstances. Sometimes we just are in a bad spot. But God is always capable of making a bad situation good. And we see this in Joseph's life. We see how Joseph went through a lot of hard stuff. But when we look back on Joseph's story, we realize that God was constantly setting him up for good things. So usually we kind of only understand what God is doing when we look back at events in our life. We can't necessarily predict what that is going to be. And sometimes we may not ever know what good God is doing. But in those cases, I think like Joseph, it's important to have faith of the God that we know is good. So when you're unsure, when you're going through a hard spot, know that God is always working to good. And we have a loving God. And we just need to have the faith to know that God is good. So I hope that you will stick around. We have, like I said, a little bit of a break through August. We'll start again in September. We have finished Unit 2, so our next time in September, we are going to start in Unit 3 in the book of Exodus. So we're going to learn about what happens after these 400 years that Joseph and his family stay in Egypt. And we're going to learn a little bit about the story of Exodus. So I hope that you stick around. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have enjoyed the book of Genesis. Good job, you guys. You finished it. So I'll see you around. Have a good one.